Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. The story begins in the Appalachians, where a man named Ed Oswald is startled by an animal in the middle of the road. He brakes just in time and lets out a sigh of relief, but soon afterwards comes a much worse scare. A young girl throws herself against the window, and the state she is in is terrifying. Not far from there, a rescue team is searching for 6 missing women. Among them is Juno, who is the niece of Senator Kaplan. They have been missing for 2 days, and consequently, the chances of finding them are becoming slimmer, despite the efforts of specialists Dan, Greg, and Katia. It is then that Sheriff Vanes receives a call from Ed regarding the survivor. He asks for complete confidentiality and heads to the hospital with his colleague, Ellen Rios. The doctor says the girl's name is Sarah and explains that she seems to have lost the memory of the past few days. He also states that despite the condition of her clothes, she isn't that injured. Hearing this, the sheriff orders that the samples from Sarah's clothes be tested. While Ellen talks to Sarah, the girl is still very confused and doesn't know how she ended up there. Ellen explains that a few days ago, she went on a trip with her friends. The group went to explore Borum Cave and never returned. Spotting a photo of herself with 2 of her friends, Sarah recognizes Juno and Beth. But then she starts asking about her daughter, Jessie, and becomes inconsolable upon hearing that the girl died in Scotland a year ago. Meanwhile, Ed takes a police officer to the spot where Sarah showed up. The dog picks up her trail until they reach a lake right in front of the chapel mines and then goes through a hole in the boards. The officer starts to worry about the delay until the dog suddenly reappears and bolts away, as if it had found something very frightening inside. Knowing this, Vanes asks Dan to take his team to the mines. When the doctor says that the blood on Sarah's clothes matches Juno's, he decides to drag her along too. Ellen is outraged by the attitude but can do nothing. The 3 arrive at chapel along with Dan's team. Ed mentions that his grandfather worked in the mines until he discovered a huge cave gallery. The company sent him down to investigate, and he was never seen again. Greg and Katia get excited about the idea of unknown caves, but Dan comments that this makes the maps useless for the search. Since Sarah is the only one among them who has been down there, Vanes states that she needs to go down with the team. Dan recommends not taking firearms, as any shot could cause damage, but the sheriff refuses to descend unarmed. Then, everyone enters the mine elevator and hopes it is functioning. After a few jolts on the way down, the group reaches the final level, which looks like the set of a haunted house. Finding a passage to an even lower level, Dan takes the lead, and everyone follows him. When a sudden creak startles them, Dan comments that it's the wooden beams. He says that this is better than in modern mines, where the metal beams don't give any warning before collapsing. The comment only makes everyone more nervous as they move forward until reaching the access point to the caves. Greg goes ahead, and his flashlight illuminates what appears to be the skull of a large animal. The tunnel's mouth is blocked by a sign with warnings of danger, recommending to keep a distance. Ignoring this, the group simply removes the sign and crosses through to an impressive cave. Dan reminds everyone that this place must be over 1,000 years old and asks that no one touch anything. Sarah runs her flashlight along the cave walls, trying to remember something. Then, something seems to move suddenly, and she screams. Ellen fears that the others will get irritated with her and explains that it was just a scare, but Greg goes over to check and says it's just calcium deposits. Entering a second tunnel, the group reaches a fork, and Katia tries to amplify the sound to decide which path is more promising. What she hears seems to be the sound of wings followed by a creaking noise, but the volume is still too low for her to distinguish the sounds well. Taking a few steps forward, Katia is horrified to stumble upon a woman who appears to have been torn apart. Dan asks Sarah not to look, and then everyone is startled when the woman's mouth suddenly opens. Checking the body temperature with the devices, Greg states that it's impossible for her to be alive. We soon see that he is right, as a rat crawls out of the woman's mouth, explaining the movement. Sarah feels sick upon seeing this, but the sheriff shows no compassion. In fact, he does exactly the opposite and begins accusing her of knowing more than she is saying. While Ellen and Greg defend the survivor, Dan realizes she is more than that. Vanes has been so cold from the beginning because he sees her as a suspect in the case. Greg starts to crawl through another tunnel, this one even tighter than the previous one. Ellen tries to help Sarah remember, and we see her mind being flooded with flashes full of horror. She says that there is something in the caves and that they shouldn't have come down there now. Through the radio, Greg informs Dan that he has reached another chamber and asks the others to follow him. Everyone begins to crawl along the same path, and Vanes makes a point of keeping Sarah between the two police officers. Ellen feels short of breath in the final stretch, and Greg tries to calm her down. Curled up in the middle of the tunnel, Sarah begins to remember her friends and the terrible end of each one. Behind her, Vanes mutters orders to move forward and tells her to stop stalling. Then Sarah delivers two powerful kicks right in his head, exits the tunnel with agility, and strikes both Greg and Ellen. When they recover, she has already escaped through one of the many possible passages. Then Dan realizes that Vanes has also disappeared, and Ellen states that he went after Sarah. Knowing that neither of them has a radio, he says they need to catch up with them before they get lost. Choosing one of the paths, the four reach a section where the ceiling is unstable, and everyone needs to move very carefully. In another part of the underground gallery, Vanes remembers that he has the camera and activates the night vision before moving forward, holding the gun. He is very focused on the screen when a humanoid creature suddenly appears next to the camera. The scare makes Vanes fall backward, accidentally squeezing the trigger. This causes a landslide in the entire area, and parts of the cave begin to collapse, sealing off passages with fallen rocks. Dan, Ellen, and Greg are still together, but Katya is trapped amidst the rocks. Through the radio, Dan says he is going to rescue her and asks her to stay calm. But he is the one who loses his temper when he sees the amount of stones blocking the way. Yelling and cursing, he curses the Americans and their habit of shooting at everything. Dan only calms down when Ellen says that Katya might be able to hear him. She and Greg are just two young people, and he realizes that the two will panic if he himself loses control. Calling Katya over the radio, he asks her to try to get out of there, but she says she will be crushed if she starts moving. Dan explains that he will have to find another way to get to her, which means they will lose signal for a while. When Vanes gets up, he realizes that his gun is also trapped between the rocks, and he can't reach it. Sarah is luckier than the others, as she manages to move without problems and even finds water to refresh herself. Katya is frightened by every noise she hears, fearing that the rocks will close in around her. Her flashlight begins to fail at just that moment, and when the light returns, the beam illuminates the gap between the rocks behind her head, and we see a creature passing quickly. Dan, Greg, and Ellen reach a space filled with carcasses on the ground. Greg finds a fallen video camera and calls the others to watch the recorded videos, unaware that Sarah is hiding nearby. They soon recognize her in the footage, along with Juno and the other four friends. The first videos are of the preparation for the adventure, but the scenes inside the cave begin to turn sinister. It seems something went very wrong, and they could no longer find their way back. The last video was recorded in the same place where they are now. Dan is startled when a creature appears right behind one of them. He asks what the hell that was, and for his misfortune, the answer soon arrives. A humanoid being appears right next to Ellen, and she begins to scream. Everyone starts running in different directions and ends up losing each other. With the camera, Dan also switches to night vision to check the surroundings and doesn't see anything there. The only one who doesn't move is Sarah. She watches the grotesque creature crouching close to her, making guttural sounds. The thing doesn't seem to see anything but light but picks up any sound quickly. Unaware of this, Ellen begins to yell, calling for Dan and Greg. She is startled when she is suddenly grabbed from behind, but we see that it's Sarah covering her mouth to protect her. A few meters away, Dan also starts calling Ellen's name. As the creature moves towards the sound, Sarah turns off the police officer's helmet light. Dan catches sight of the two through the camera lens and thinks that Sarah is taking Ellen hostage. It is then that the creature attacks him, biting his fingers before going for his neck. Ellen watches the scene in horror, while Greg only hears the attack. After killing the victim, the monster moves away, dragging Dan's body behind it. Sarah still has the presence of mind to hold onto his backpack in the utmost silence, allowing the monster to take the person out of the strap itself. Still trapped, Katya begins to feel her way through the gaps where only her arm fits, trying to map the surroundings when a slimy drool falls on her hand. With her flashlight, she tries to peek where it is coming from and comes face to face with one of the creatures, which lets out a fierce roar in her direction. Katya's luck is that the thing also can't reach her, but she sees the white paws starting to dig a passageway. Soon a slimy head breaks through at Katya's feet. Frightened, she begins to wiggle through the crevices, because now a collapse is the least of her problems. She manages to get nearly half her body through when she feels a sudden pull and is left with only her head sticking out. The stone in front of her shifts even more, crushing Katya almost completely while her legs dangle just inches from the creature. Fear gives her the strength to push the stone and escape seconds before the monster can also pass. As soon as she finds herself free, she kicks a huge rock with her foot, crushing the creature's head, and begins searching for the others until she finds Greg. Meanwhile, Vanes is still alone when he suddenly bumps into an arm. The rest of the body soon collapses next to him, and he sees that it is Dan. Greg and Katya realize that the sounds of the creatures are getting closer and decide to hide up high, balanced as a pair among the rocks. The plan is working when, once again, Vanes ruins everything by shouting into Dan's radio. His voice begins to reverberate through the cave, coming from Katya's and Greg's waists at the same time. As the creature turns around and comes after them, the two climb the rest of the way up to a higher opening, leaving one of the radios behind. Trying to find their way back, they reach a precipice and find yet another of the missing women hanging from the ceiling. Since the gap is too wide to jump straight to the other side, they resort to an unpleasant maneuver. Katya jumps onto the hanging body and grabs the rope, taking a disgusting bath. While she attempts to gain momentum, two creatures appear. One of them knocks Greg down, and the other joins the human pendulum, worsening Katya's condition. Greg gets bitten in the neck but manages to shake off the monster using a drill. Then, he makes a heroic decision and also jumps, grabbing the second creature. The two plummet into the dark abyss, leaving Katya free to escape. Reaching the other side, she still tries to call for her friend, but no one responds. Then she hears that sound again and knows her end is also near. The creature is right behind her when she turns around. Meanwhile, Sarah manages to locate the passage through which she escaped last time. Seeing that it is an almost completely submerged tunnel, Ellen begins to explain her fear of swimming, but sees that Sarah is already diving. The two begin crossing the passage, with their heads held high to breathe. In some sections, they must fully submerge. In one of them, Ellen sees that Sarah has disappeared and begins to panic until she feels her hand on her shoulder. The two continue until the end of the tunnel, but the exit is not there. Ellen starts recording a goodbye video for her daughter, and her words motivate Sarah not to lose hope. Besides them, the only one left from the team is Vanes, and one of the creatures has just found him. He manages to knock it down with a punch, but this doesn't hold it off for long. When the monster is about to pounce, a knife suddenly pierces it. Vanes can barely see what is happening but realizes it is a woman attacking the monster, and on top of that, she wins the fight. Illuminating the warrior with the flashlight, the sheriff immediately recognizes Juno. He starts to explain that he came to save her, but she approaches in a strange way and takes the flashlight from his hand. Now Sarah and Ellen are going through another uncomfortable tunnel, this time due to the narrow diameter. Then Sarah hears one of those guttural sounds and stops moving, seeing that there is a creature squeezed into the same tunnel they are in. To make matters worse, a rat appears and starts walking close to her face. Sarah holds her breath, but Ellen doesn't have the same self-control and lets out a very loud scream. The creature bares its teeth immediately and begins to crawl furiously. Ellen is shocked to see Sarah doing the same thing, but that's because she knows that rat came from somewhere. Between Sarah and the creature, there is an opening, and she manages to curve down in time. Ellen finds herself face to face with the enemy, but Sarah scares it away until she follows her. The two plunge into a well with water up to their waists, and it isn't long before the monster jumps in after them. For a moment, the two cannot see where it went, and then it appears behind Ellen. Sarah headbutts it and starts rummaging through the backpack while the thing approaches Ellen. Before the attack occurs, Sarah shoves a stretched rope between the creature's teeth and manages to push it away, but not for long. Returning to the backpack, she finds a climbing hook and uses it to strike the monster several times. When it disappears under the water, they begin to catch their breath. It is then that it resurfaces unexpectedly and grabs Sarah by the neck. Now it's Ellen's turn to save her with a very sharp hairpin. She plunges the accessory into the slimy neck and finally finishes off the monster before it can harm Sarah. The two notice a strange formation that looks like dark flakes floating in the water. Another monster appears at the edge of the well, not noticing the two down below. When it turns its back and begins to relieve itself, they realize they are inside the creature's toilet. Meanwhile, Vanes is still following Juno through the caves. A creature appears, and Juno presses the sheriff against the wall, clearly determined to kill him if he makes a sound. At the same time, Ellen asks Sarah about the previous expedition, and she says that it was Juno who convinced her to participate. The excuse was that Sarah needed to get back to living her life after losing her husband and daughter, but during the trip, it was revealed that Juno had an affair with Sarah's husband and was only trying to ease her guilt. After the other four were devoured, Sarah injured Juno and let the creatures attack her. That's what allowed her to escape. Soon after telling the story, Sarah faces an unexpected reunion with Juno. The two begin to fight, and Juno easily wins the brawl. But when she raises her arm to finish Sarah off, Ellen decides to intervene with a lie, saying that the rescue was organized by Sarah to save her. She gives up on revenge, but the atmosphere between them remains tense. Juno states that the monsters hunt on the surface as well, and she has found out where they pass. Ellen and Sarah prefer to follow the water until they reach the lake, but Vanes decrees that everyone will follow Juno and even handcuffs Sarah's wrist to prevent her from escaping. The path is anything but easy, and one part is almost collapsing. It is safest for them to cross one at a time, but Vanes refuses to release the handcuffs. Unable to bear the weight, the rock gives way right beneath him, and the sheriff hangs precariously at the edge. Juno says there is no way to save both of them and tells Ellen to separate them with the axe. The creatures eagerly climb the precipice while she strikes her boss's extended arm, and one of them is already hanging around his neck when he falls. The three continue on until they reach the place where the monsters feed. Juno's theory is proven when one of them arrives with a deer, confirming that the exit is that way. However, now they need to get there without making any noise, which slows their progress. Juno is just a few meters from the passage when Greg, who is near death, grabs her leg. She doesn't hold back her scream, and the creatures immediately grow agitated. The three start to fight and take down several of the monsters. Ellen shows Sarah that the path out is clear, but she sees that Juno is struggling against one of the creatures and decides to help her to redeem herself for what she did last time. She manages to push the monster away with a chain, but it ends up hitting Juno in the stomach. She still manages to lift herself one last time and tears part of the creature's throat out, but unfortunately, she succumbs soon afterward. Sarah cries for her friend while Ellen pleads that she hurry up. Only then does she realize that there are several creatures behind her, and many others are approaching from all sides. No matter how quiet she stays, it's only a matter of time before the worst happens. Faced with this, Sarah stands up and begins to scream, attracting all the monsters to herself at once. Ellen runs toward the light and climbs the tunnel until she finally reaches the surface. Very weak and disoriented, she runs through the forest until she remembers her cell phone. But before she can make a call, Ed appears behind her and hits her head with a shovel. He looks around to make sure there are no witnesses and then drags Ellen back to the hole. She is starting to wake up when a monster comes to get her.